Hello and welcome to the very first NCE study guide tutoring video. Right now we are in the theories of development stage, so we're going to talk about different theories of development. And today we're talking about Lawrence Kohlberg's theory of moral development. Kohlberg lived from 1927 to 1987, and I think it's important to give those dates just so chronologically you can keep each of the different psychologists that we'll talk about together. So again, Kohlberg lived from 1927 to 1987. Some important ideas, terms, people associated with Kohlberg. I've got the list right here, but we'll talk about each one of these. Heinz dilemma is a question that is associated with Kohlberg. Carol Gilligan is a famous psychologist that was an understudy with Kohlberg, and there can be a lot of questions sometimes that are about the association between the two of them. And then there's three different stages that we're going to talk about today: the pre-conventional, conventional, and post-conventional. Each of these terms, though, are terms that are pretty specific towards Kohlberg, or ideas that are specific towards Kohlberg. To start off with, Heinz dilemma is a question that Kohlberg developed in 1963. It's pretty famous, especially in the field of ethics itself. It's not uncommon for students, pretty much from about the early 1980s all the way up to now, for students in ethics courses to get this question. And it's a special question because Kohlberg used it to ultimately assess people all the way from children who could barely understand the question, all the way up to adults who grasped the question's meaning. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to retell what the question is. And there's different questions on the NCE that sometimes target Heinz dilemma and Kohlberg and the relationship between those two. So I'm going to give you a pictographic form of memorization to help you understand what this question is about. But this is what the question basically says. So in the beginning, it says a woman was near death from a special kind of cancer. And so I've got a gravestone here. It says that there was one drug that the doctors thought might save her. It was a form of radium that a druggist in the same town had recently discovered. The drug was expensive to make, but the druggist was charging 10 times what the drug cost him to produce. He paid $200 for the radium and charged $2,000 for a small dose of the drug. So we've got the gravestone because the woman was near her death from a special kind of cancer. We've got the medicine box here because the druggist was charging $2,000 for something that costs about $200. The sick woman's husband, Heinz, went to everyone he knew to borrow the money, but he could only get together about $1,000, which is half of what it cost. He told the druggist that his wife was dying and asked him to sell it cheaper or let him pay later. But the druggist said, "No, I discovered the drug and I'm going to make money from it." So again, Heinz, the sick woman's husband, is going to pay the druggist all the money that he has, but that's still not enough compared to what the druggist charges, and the druggist refuses to lower the price for Heinz. So Heinz gets desperate and broke into the man's store to steal the drug for his wife. So there we are, there's Heinz stealing the drug for his wife. And then the question of this dilemma is, right, should Heinz have broken into the laboratory to steal the drug for his wife? Why or why not? And so anyway, this was a question that Kohlberg used again on kids, on teenagers, on adults to try and get a sense of their moral development. And so he kind of gauged from asking several different people this question how human beings ultimately develop a sense of morality. Take a moment and see if you can retell this story just using these graphics. Kohlberg's theory of moral development actually has 6 stages. I've got them all listed here, and I'll talk about each of them in detail. But ultimately, when people talk about Kohlberg's theory of moral development, they typically refer to it in 3 parts: the pre-conventional, conventional, and post-conventional stage. I'm going to give you some mnemonic devices to help you organize these stages together. And I'm also going to talk about them in detail. So if you're trying to figure out a way to kind of organize all the information, I'll give you a few different ways to do that. One way that you can organize this information is to color code the different stages. So to think of the first stage, the pre-conventional, as orange, the second stage, conventional, as green, and the third stage, the post-conventional, as blue. And so you just think orange, green, blue, OGB, orange, green, blue. And the orange really stands for obedience, because a lot of the governing dynamics of the pre-conventional stage deal with our sense of obedience. The 7 to 11-year-old stage, the G, the green part, that has to do with group dynamics, how individuals start to work with groups as they become older. And then the blue stage, right, 12 and older, that really has to do with seeing beyond group dynamics and thinking about a larger, what Kohlberg calls universal principles. So again, if you just think about that in terms of the color coding, orange, green, and blue, that can help you with, again, obedience, group dynamics beyond the group. That's just a kind of a quick mnemonic device to help you organize the information quickly here. Um, I like to color code different things, and I find that using colors really helps me study. If this doesn't make sense to you, and you're a person who prefers more of a list or a canon of different terms and ideas, then we can just skip through this part. But I'll come back to this and repeat it just to see if it makes sense to you. So to go a little bit more in depth with Kohlberg's first 2 stages, again, this is often referred to as the pre-conventional stage from 0 to 6 years old. But there's basically kind of 2 different separate parts that Kohlberg sees happening in our moral development. So initially, Kohlberg believes that we, in our infancy, develop a sense of what morality is based strictly off of ideas about obedience and punishment. Doing the right thing is basically avoiding punishment, and doing the wrong thing involves some lack of obedience. As we get older, right, we move towards our preschool years, we start to move away from understanding rights as avoiding punishment. And instead, we start to understand it a lot more in terms of what is within our immediate self-interest. And so as we start to align our interest with a reward system, we start moving away from that idea about punishment. And so by the time that we're in preschool, we pretty much have developed our sense of morality in terms of self-interest, or what other people might refer to as egoism. Kohlberg thought that from there, after our preschool years, we start to make an effort to secure the approval of other people. And so, using that same guiding self interest, we try to maintain friendly relationships with other people. And so, as we move into the elementary school age, we start to care a lot more about how we interact with individuals. That's the idea of interpersonal accord, and conformity starts to become an important moral guiding principle as we start to conform to certain rules in order to secure that approval from other people. And of course, as this idea of conformity starts to develop, we also start to understand that there are rules about which guide society. And so as we move away from the elementary school years into our middle school years, we start to be oriented a lot more towards those rules, maintaining a particular kind of social order. And that idea about interpersonal accord, which began with our self interest in our elementary school years, starts to really evolve towards thinking about not just our immediate peer group, but also society at large. And so we start to understand that, the person who is in front of me in traffic, even though I don't know them entirely, there's certain rules that they're agreeing to obey in order for me to be able to move along in the car. And that extends, across the entire society towards everyone. So again, that's the conventional stage where we're kind of orienting ourselves towards this kind of group dynamic where immediately in elementary school years, we see the group dynamic working together with the people that we're familiar with. But then as we move towards the middle school years, it extends out towards a much larger group, society at large. And so for Kohlberg, the post-conventional stage starts to develop during our teenage years. So once we get past 12 years old, we start to think in terms of what's referred to as utilitarianism and contractarianism. And what that just simply means is that we start to see things in this reciprocal sort of manner. And so what goodness ultimately is from this standpoint is the thing that brings the maximum goodness to the maximum amount of people. We're trying to avoid pain and maximize happiness under the contractarian kind of view. And so we start to think about the difference between what is legally right and what is morally right. And we start to develop a sense that even though there are rules that are in place that make society good and makes society function, there is some standard that exists even beyond those legal terms that make society work even better. And so we start trying to extend that sense of rulership, not just to the whole group of people that we're looking at, but even thinking about more flexible and ultimately autonomous views about morality itself. And so this takes us into adulthood, where Kohlberg theorizes that ultimately people um, start to create principles based off of those views of transcendence that they were developing. Again, making that differentiation that there is something not just about legal efforts to make society right, but there is a deeper, larger moral underpinning about what society is supposed to be like. So even though we may not be able to hold people to a certain legal standard, there are still rules in place, still ideas about what it means to be right, what it means to be virtuous, that we should hold to. And again, for Kohlberg, those rules are universal. So we might think about what constitutes a right action and how an action may be right for one person, but could be wrong for somebody else given different circumstances. If we go back and we think about the question in Heinz' dilemma, this was what Kohlberg really was interested in on this idea of universal principles is can people get past just think about the consequences of their actions and really articulate a true universal principle of why Heinz is justified or not justified in stealing the medication from the druggist. So again, if we go back to that color coding stage one more time, and again, if this doesn't work for you, you can just skip this part. But again, think of that first stage, that pre-conventional stage, as orange. And again, that was really this orientation towards obedience. Morality is really just obeying and ultimately trying to avoid getting punished. That evolves towards those group dynamics, the green, to where we try and again work with other people, create rules, start to conform towards those rules, and start to look at people beyond just our immediate peer group to a larger group. And then we finish in that post-conventional stage on blue, which is beyond the group. And we're really, again, looking for kind of universal principles, not just good rules that help govern society, but rules that we would suggest are universal and moral, and maybe they don't benefit society at large, but we would agree that in the context of certain situations, they're the right thing to do. And so if we take a look at that one last time, again, for the orange, I've got the pre-conventional stage there. The green, I've got the conventional stage. And for the blue, I've got the post-conventional stage. Feel free to pause this video if you need to take a longer look at any of those stages. The final thing that I want to talk about is Carol Gilligan. And it's important to kind of point out a few things about Carol Gilligan. So, one is that she was the understudy for Lawrence Kohlberg. She was a graduate student, and she is still alive to this day. She was born in 1936. I am making this video in 2022, but probably the two most important things about Carol Gilligan is that she wrote a book called In a Different Voice, which was a feminist take on Kohlberg's theory of morality. And to be perfectly honest, this book is a lot more influential now than what Kohlberg's theory ended up being. I say that because it's the basis for the ethics of care. A lot of people in the field of ethics look at this book as the kind of beginning basis for a whole new normative theory of ethics. And Kohlberg's theory, using Gilligan's critique of the theory, has been seen to miss some important distinctions. Particularly, Gilligan's critique is that it misattributes a certain level of morality. One of the interesting findings in Kohlberg's study is that men tend to have more universal principles than women do. And Gilligan thought that was suspicious because what it ultimately means is that men have a greater moral capacity than what women do. And she set out using the same framework that Kohlberg used, looking at an alternative way of looking at the stages that Kohlberg developed and thinking that perhaps there was a different way of viewing it. And so she has three different stages as well, and in a different voice articulates these different stages that Kohlberg developed as well. But for her, she sees the development of the pre-conventional stage as not being rooted necessarily in this obedience and avoidance of punishment, so much as an orientation towards survival. Gilligan thought that survival was a big part of how our minds develop a sense of morality, and that morality can really, in a lot of ways, be traced to this sense of survival. And so for Gilligan, we evolve a sense of goodness out of this sense of being oriented towards survival. And we start to understand as we move towards that, again, that 7 to 11-year-old area, that conventional stage, we start to move towards a sense of goodness. She thought not as a governing group dynamic, like Kohlberg talks about, but instead as this idea of self-sacrifice. Right? We start to understand that there are things beyond ourselves in the world, and that we can't always have what we want. And so, you might see somebody at the age of 5 or 6 who's still in that first stage, right? Wanting, for instance, to always play the game that they want to play. But as they get a little bit older, start to move towards 7 or 8 years old, they start to understand that if they want other people to play with them, they've got to be willing to play the games that other people want to play sometimes. And so they decide to, instead of always advocating for the thing that they want to do, they start to understand that they need to sacrifice sometimes, so that they can be, a good friend to somebody else, and they can play those other games. And so, as that starts to develop, Gilligan thought, well, there's kind of another thing that goes along with that. And so as we start to move towards that same area that Kohlberg talked about as a post-conventional, right, in the teenage years, past 12 years old, um, Gilligan thought we also need to have a sense of being able to assert ourselves, towards others. That is, there's a time when we have to stand up for ourselves, but not in a way that, is violent, and not in a way that's passive, but instead in a way, that truly understands the autonomy that other people have while advocating for ourselves. And so that third stage, she lists as the morality of nonviolence, or the belief of morality, of nonviolence. And in this sense, it's truly, working with other people to try and, um, not, as Kohlberg mentions, articulate a universal morality, but instead come to an agreement, about the way in which the world, operates, pragmatically for both individuals. And this is why it becomes the basis for the ethics of care, because I'm sure you've probably heard of that old adage that, if you want to take care of somebody else, you first have to learn how to take care of yourself. If you're on an airplane, and the gas masks fall down, you've got to be able to put the gas mask on yourself first, or the oxygen mask on yourself first, before you can help somebody else out. And that's really what that third stage of the morality of nonviolence is about. Is like, once we establish that other people are important, and once we understand, that, we can't have everything the way that we want it, we have to figure out what's the kind of perfect compromise. How can I be caring towards other people so that I'm also, taking care of myself? And so, in a nutshell, that's Carol Gilligan's response, to Lawrence Kohlberg. And again, she thought that question of Heinz' dilemma, she didn't think it was a bad question. She just thought that Kohlberg's interpretation, left out an important dimension of the development of morality. Chances are, because the NCE is still focused on a lot of the old school views, you probably won't see a question about Carol Gilligan, but there will most definitely be at least one question about Lawrence Kohlberg's theory of development somewhere along the lines. Hope this has been helpful, and have a great day.